I'm going to invite Professor Lucie Cluver. Lucie, it's hard to introduce her because more than anything else, she's a mentor, a friend, and a confidant. And so the things that Lucie knows could put me in jail. I am delighted to invite Professor Lucie Cluver, who is a professor at the University of Oxford and at the University of Cape Town. Again, collaborations and the power that has. She works with a team in between the locations to deliver a program that's called the Accelerate Hub. I urge you all to go and look it up. Besides that, she's worked with the South African government, UNICEF, World Food Programme, anybody who means anything to you and affects how we live our lives to deliver impactful programs for adolescents across, I think, 24 African countries and impacting, I think, over 200 million families with her work. And I'm inviting Lucie to close the date for us and help us think really how we move from this incredible research to impact, to changing people's lives, and the lessons that we can learn from all the conversations we've had today. And Lucie also happens to be a member of our steering board at AFOX, so I'm in the presence of my bosses. Welcome, Lucie.
Thank you. I'm really nervous, actually, and I was trying to work out why. And I think it's because I've realized that this meeting, we'll move to mine in a minute. This meeting, I was sort of thinking, this meeting of one thing, and I realized it's more like, you know, those like charity concerts where they get all the rock stars together. It's been like that today. It's been a series of rock stars. And so actually, what I'm going to talk about is it said 10 lessons, it's actually 12 lessons that I've learned and mistakes that I've made and things that I wish I'd known 20 years ago in starting on research with the goal of policy impact. And if you disagree, or if you have things that I've missed or things that you think could be just done much better, please interrupt and tell me. Because I think, and tell us, because I think this is something that I'm still learning. So I was trying to think through what would be the key things that we could take as we embark upon research with the ultimate and focused goal of improving the lives of people in Africa. And it's not always an obvious route, and it's certainly not something that people teach you in your doctorate or in your master's or really at any point. But I came up with 12 lessons, and I'm going to talk through each one. So the first one is to listen. And I think about this as being absolutely fundamental. We're often taught that research has to come from us, or from reading books, or from reading papers, and in many ways it does. But often the people who really understand what policymakers need are policymakers themselves. And this is, I think, the example that jumped to me. In 2011, I was in Addis Ababa, and I was talking to a group of people at the African Union about a research study which we were doing on children affected by AIDS. We'd interviewed families across 3 provinces in South Africa. And a woman who I'd never met before cornered me in the corner, sort of in one of those funny little tables where you have to stand up, and when you're short like me, the table comes up to here. So I was perching my coffee. And her name was Dr. Rachel Yates, and she was the chief of HIV and AIDS at UNICEF. And she said to me, you've got this sample of 5,000 families across South Africa, and you're following them longitudinally. She said, can you tell me whether accessing a government cash transfer, a government grant, can prevent HIV? I was like, well, this wasn't our research question. I don't know, I don't think we can. And then I went away and thought about it. And it just happened that in our longitudinal survey, we were interviewing these young people across 4 years, that it just happened to be the same 4 years that the South African government was expanding its child support grant from a grant that went up to age 7 to a grant that went up to age 18. And like any other country, that expansion was lopsided and went better in some areas than others. And what we had created without planning or knowing was a natural experiment. It took us 18 months and lots of napkins. If anyone's been to Branca in Jericho, all the napkins on the back of that were where we worked out what the statistics were we needed to do this. But what it came out with after 18 months was the fact that adolescent girls, and this is just looking at girls, in a family who received a government cash transfer, this was $20 per month, 200 Rand per month at that point, had a 50% incidence reduction in having transactional sex and a 70% incidence reduction in having age-disparate sex. We know from phylogenetic studies that these are our two biggest risks for contracting HIV. This research went on to guide PEPFAR's $1 billion investment in DREAMS and became one of the required inputs and services for DREAMS provisions. If I had not listened to Rachel Yates when she cornered me over coffee in Addis, I would never have even thought of doing this research. So lesson 1 was listen. Lesson 2 is sometimes don't listen. And this is probably still one of the biggest failures that I feel and the biggest things that I regret in my career. When we were doing the study that I showed you in the last slide, we were in Mpumalanga, and our research teams were walking down the road, and a little girl was walking next to them with a big backpack, her school backpack, and she collapsed on the side of the road. And our team took her to hospital, and it later transpired that this little girl was living with HIV, but was unable to take her medications for a whole set of complicated family reasons. And I thought about this little girl, and I thought about when we had started delivering antiretrovirals in South Africa. We only really started delivering them in about sort of between 2004 to 2007. And so this was our first cohort of those babies who were surviving into adolescence. And I went to Columbia University, and saw that they had a cohort of these adolescents who, because they had started much, much earlier, who were living into adolescence and having enormous problems with their antiretrovirals. They were struggling to take them. There were high rates of morbidity and mortality. And I saw that coming in our future. I saw that this was the cohort that we were going to have across Sub-Saharan Africa. And I went back to South Africa, and I met with our Minister of Health to say we need to set up plans and research to be ready for this. Unfortunately, for those who know South Africa, I went to the wrong Minister of Health. Manto Shabalala shouted at me and screamed at me and sent me out of her office. And I did not do that study. I thought, this is the Minister of Health and she has told me don't do it, and I didn't do it. And 7 years later, we had 1.7 million adolescents living with HIV. And every problem that we had seen in Colombia was happening in South Africa. We set up the study then, 7 years too late. That study has had impact, sure. I mean, this is some work done by my student CNI, who's just found that amongst these adolescents living with HIV, those who receive economic and psychosocial support have very much reduced rates of viral load through increased adherence. We've been able to use this kind of work to inform the South African National Youth Health Policy and to support PEPFAR and UNICEF programming. But it was 7 years too late. I shouldn't have listened. My next lesson is one that I'm not sure is right for research, or whether it's just right for the kind of people we want to be, but it seize the day. I tried to look up Carpe Diem in Xhosa, and I could not make sense of the translation. When COVID-19 hit, and there was a day when it was announced, everyone who was a parent might remember the day that it was announced that schools and nurseries were going to close. And I didn't think, I just got on with my emails. And I woke up at 5 a.m. the next morning in a cold sweat. And it was for two reasons. The first was I thought, how the hell am I going to look after my 2 children and manage to work? I had a baby who was under 1 and a 3-year-old at the time. And the second reason was because when I was a social worker, we always knew that holidays and any kind of health emergency, any kind of emergency, meant that we saw rates of violence skyrocket. And this happens not just because we're cooped up with each other, but because we're under enormous pressure. We're under economic pressure and mental health pressure and distress. And under those situations of a pressure cooker, we will always see increases in domestic violence and in violence against children. And so at 5 o'clock in the morning, I wrote to 5 colleagues in WHO and UNICEF, in the CDC, in UNHCR and UNODC. And I said, we need to do something. At midday that day, we got together, along with a whole set more colleagues who they'd contacted. And we decided that we needed to launch an emergency parenting violence prevention response. Within 10 days, and with a huge host of volunteers, we managed to turn a set of parenting programs which we'd developed and tested into a set of sheets, tip sheets, radio programs, public service announcements. It turns out I'm terrible at writing public service announcements, but luckily other people could. Translated them by volunteers, many of whom actually were volunteers from AFOX, from the university, into 114 languages. And over the next year, those were shared to 210 million people through 34 national government programs. I still don't know, was that good research? It probably wasn't. We did some research, it wasn't very good research on it, but I think there are moments when you just have to recognize that something has happened, and we can use the research that we have and the experience and the contacts we have to make a substantial difference. So, I would like you to know that there is no good photo online of these two people together, so I had to take this yesterday. But Kevin and Anne have taught me something really fundamental, and this is also not something that anyone tells you in research, but that is that you gain strength by building up others. We're often taught in research that it's a dog-eat-dog game. You know, you hide your results until you're published. You protect your career. You push yourself forward. Of course you need to push your career and protect yourself. But it often leads to a culture where we are not thinking about the common goal. We are thinking about ourselves. I met yesterday, actually, with a sort of lead in the Swedish government. And he said, you know, we get these situations where there are 25 academics and they are all arguing that their program is the best one. And he said, we don't know what to do. It means we do nothing. And I thought that is what we have to get beyond. We have to be at a point where we can say, we are all in this together. And you know what? Like, there are these people studying stuff in America, and there are like 5,000 people studying one tiny bit of a mental health problem, like, I don't know, self-efficacy amongst 12 to 13-year-olds in high schools in, I don't know, Detroit. We are not in that situation. We are in a continent where there is so much more research than we can ever cover, that what we need to be doing is thinking as a team. We need to be building up other researchers, supporting students, supporting young people. And not only when we do that do we build a better set of research, but we also build the confidence of those policymakers who are fed up with squabbling academics all standing there saying, it's me, use me, and move towards a stage where we're saying, that's the person you need to talk to about that because they know what they're doing. And I think these two, with their, and the whole AFOX team actually, with their kind of incredibly unselfish approach to promoting others, have really taught me about that. They could do better on good photos online, though. And I think when we talk about building up others, we also have to put our money where our mouth is. And we've started doing annual reporting of what proportion of our papers as a team are led by first authored by early career researchers. And that is keeping us honest doing this kind of reporting. And it's I think, just something to help think about this. You know, we know that's the currency of our careers, and we've got to put our money where our mouth is with this. So the next thing I want to say is, this is pretty controversial. Don't write papers, talk. Now, of course, we've got to write papers as well. But I think in my 20 years of my career, I have heard a policymaker who has told me that they have read my papers once. It is not the way, primarily, to get into research. The exception to that is things like WHO guidelines, where the complete set of nerds will go and read every possible paper. That's an exception to that. For the general rule, they are not going to read your papers. They are going to, and they probably won't even read your policy brief unless it is 1 page long and someone hands it to them in the back of the car on the way to the meeting. But what they will do is listen to your talks. And this is an opportunity. And I was talking this week with Samson Kinyanjui, who said something I think really profound. Did I say your name right? We were practicing saying each other's names. We both got it wrong. But Samson said, we are taught in our region to be deferential, not to speak unless we are asked. And that may be good for many things, but it is not good for having policy impact. And we have to force ourselves to put our hand up, to stand up, to get up and give those talks and do it over and over again. I sometimes think that every government meeting is a paper not written. But is it worth it? Ultimately, yes, it's worth it to have impact. And I'm showing this picture. This is my student Sia, who you saw, who created that table a few pages back. And the reason I'm showing Sia is because he's standing up there giving a talk. This is at an HIV/AIDS meeting to a set of policymakers. He was terrified before that talk, and he nailed it. And after that talk, PEPFAR came up to him at the end and said, can we have copies of your slides? Because we're doing our country operating plans and we need that evidence. I didn't put Nontokozo because she's a really great talker and she's not as terrified. So the next message is to find allies. People often talk about influencing policymakers. And I'm not sure that's the right goal at all. I think what really works is when you find those people who have the same goal as you. And then what you're doing, you're not having to influence them. What you're doing is you are working together to do what you both want to do better. But this does require something really crucial. It actually requires that you have to not be thinking about your own career at this stage. And I think that's for 2 reasons. The first is that policymakers are really smart, and they can see through it when you're trying to say to them, do this, but actually you're thinking, hey, maybe this will get me somewhere. This will get me a professorship. This will get me a paper in the Lancet. They see through you in a heartbeat, actually. And so sometimes you have to really think, can we think about this common greater goal? And the career stuff will happen. And that's a hard thing to say and a hard decision to make. And I was actually thinking this was a good example because earlier this week I was at a meeting, and at that meeting was a colleague who runs this movement. This is the Brave movement of survivors of sexual violence who are activists, and they are pushing for governments to change their approaches and to do something about sexual violence in childhood. And I was having dinner with this lady and also with our major funder. It's a major funder, the major funder in the world on childhood sexual violence. And my partner and colleague went off to take a phone call, and the funder looked at me and she said, Lucie, if I have to make a choice to fund one thing in the next 2 years on childhood sexual violence, should I fund prevention, which is what I do, or should I fund activism, which is what my colleague does? And I knew if I said prevention, that money was coming to me. And if I said activism, that money was not going to me. And I had to think, what is best for this field? What do we need in this field? And actually, the answer to what we need in the next 2 years is probably activism. And so I took a deep breath and said what was best for the field and not what was best for me. So when I have no job and no funding in the next 2 years, you'll know why. But ultimately, when those choices come and those decisions have to be made, that's where you have to think about allies and not influencing. So the next thing is actually more pragmatic. It's to think sometimes not just about like a government, for example, but about the constellation around that government of who makes decisions, who has legitimacy, and who has money. And often, you know, when I talk to kind of colleagues in like FCDO, they say, are you working with a government? Sometimes that is not, working with a government alone is not going to be enough. And I think these are two examples led by two of my colleagues. One in the middle is the Global Fund. And my colleague Ilona, with Nontokozo and other colleagues, have been working for 2 years with the Global Fund to essentially produce evidence to persuade them not to only spend their money on antiretrovirals and PrEP, but also to spend their money on sexual violence prevention, on cash transfers, on the things which will allow young people to take those antiretrovirals and use that PrEP. The other, and believe me, working with the Global Fund is no joke for that, because there are a lot of people there who really strongly believe that as funds go down, you just focus on the biomedical. But on the left is another example, which is about legitimacy. And this is led by my colleague Frances Gardner, who did a massive systematic review of reviews covering 450 randomized control trials to produce global guidance on parenting programs. Kevin's led something similar for malaria. But that is also a fundamental role in, because if you can get that right, then a poster with what you found goes up on every single clinic in Africa to guide what people will make decisions for. Lesson number 8 is to think, what are the challenges for a policymaker, not the challenges for us. And the greatest people who taught me about this are Coca-Cola. So when you see an advert for Coca-Cola, like so if I'm making Coca-Cola, right, I'm thinking about like how much sugar do I put in, how much brown stuff goes in, how much can I get away with, right? But when you look at the posters, you know, you're driving through Gauteng or Nairobi, and you look at the posters, what the posters show you is a really beautiful woman with sunshine drinking Coca-Cola. And that is because the people who brilliantly sell us Coca-Cola are thinking about what we want, what matters to us, not what matters to them. And I think as researchers, often what we do is we show a big diagram. We have this much sugar in our Coca-Cola, and we have this much water, and this is how we combine them. But actually, if we want policymakers to do what research is telling them, we have to understand what it is that they need to know. This is a great example led by my colleague Lorraine Scher, and this comes from governments saying to us, I will explain it. This comes from governments saying to us, we don't want to deliver 17 interventions at once. Don't come to us with a list of 17 packages of 17 things we ought to do, because we can at most do 2 or 3. So my colleague said, okay, well, let's see what happens when you deliver 2 or 3 interventions instead of 10 interventions. And if you just look at this, she's looking at accelerator interventions, which are interventions which have multiple impacts. They're things like cash transfers, sexual and reproductive health programs, parenting programs. And what we see is that the jump from no interventions to 1 is big. The jump from 1 intervention to 2 is pretty big. The jump from 2 to 3 is smaller. And after that, essentially, it plateaus out. And we have been able to take that and go to governments and say, you know what, you can't easily deliver more than 3 interventions, but look what you can do with 2 to 3. Look what you can invest in. Let's find the best of that list of 17, or maybe the ones in that 17 that you can deliver, and let's deliver them effectively. And we've seen again and again that coming to policymakers and asking what their needs are, what their challenges is, can produce very concrete results. This is a recent and ongoing example led by a set of doctoral students, actually, and postdocs at UCT in Oxford, where the South African national government came to us and said that they've developed a new policy on learner pregnancy. And we've got a big study of 1,000 adolescent mothers and their children in South Africa. And they said, look, we've got 3 policy goals. They are to get them to return to school, to get them to do well in school, and to prevent rapid repeat pregnancies. And so we took our study of 1,000 adolescent girls. This is a multi-level longitudinal model which tested what things do they need to do to achieve their 3 goals. Not our 3 goals, their 3 goals. And the set of things on the left is what they are now putting into the operationalization of that national policy. And I think it's an example of how we can have that direct impact if we understand what they want as a starting point. Lesson number 9, and this is something that, again, I don't think people taught me until people in UNICEF really taught me this, was to think at the outset about delivery and scale. And a colleague at UNICEF, we were doing this work on parenting programs. We created and tested these parenting programs. And really, they were ones that could be delivered to hundreds of thousands of people at most. And a gentleman called Cornelius Williams, who was head of child protection at UNICEF, said to me, Lucie, if we are going to deliver these parenting programs, we have to work out a way to deliver them to hundreds of millions, not to hundreds of thousands. And so we adapted those programs, and it's been we're still in the middle of testing those adaptations into digital and hybrid digital programs to see, can we deliver something at that level of scale? Now, this comes with a bit of a warning. And the warning is that sometimes when you do this, the policy uptake is a bit faster than you'd like. So in the training sessions for our randomized control trial, the Minister of Social Development, it's a longer name, in Tanzania, came to visit our training session of our facilitators. And the next thing we knew, this is a picture of the President of the Prime Minister of Tanzania, announcing that our parenting program, digital parenting program, was going to be the new national Tanzanian parenting program. This is 2 months before our randomized control trial even started. So what I can say from this, we've got some good pilot results. We don't yet have randomized control trial results. We're hoping the Tanzanian government will be slow enough that we can manage to do our trial before the scale up. But I think it is a demonstration that when you come in and think about delivery and scale, you can have impact. Let us pray that it works, is all I can say. So lesson number 10 is to use the networks that you make here. You can never doubt the power of those networks. And I think an example of this was, and an example of networks was, look, mine went through the Mac PC exchange as well. It wasn't just you. But was a pastor in Zambia called Reverend Billions, during the early days of COVID, saw many parents dying and grandparents dying and was worried about the children. He rang a colleague who he knew through his church called Susan Hillis, who was a captain in the CDC, and said, what are we going to do about the orphans of COVID? Susan rang me at 2 a.m. She doesn't have a good sense of British timelines. And said, Lucie, what we need is the world's best modelers to understand how many children are orphaned by COVID. Now, the lucky thing was that my kids were at university childcare. And in the university childcare, another of the fathers was a man called Seth Flaxman, Professor Seth Flaxman, who was on the Imperial College COVID modelling team. So while we stood around a COVID-closed playground in the freezing cold November, I said to him, do you think you'd have a couple of days just to help me out with something small? 2 years later, and 6 publications later, we found that over 12 million children have lost their parents to COVID. That has resulted in a CDC and World Bank publication. It's also resulted in 2 national governments changing their policies about support for orphan children. It's resulted in a World Bank Rapid Social Response Fund, which was just launched last week and which we are on the panel for deciding. It's resulted in a Vatican decree. I never thought I'd manage that, but I didn't do it. Someone else did that. They got 1 minute with the Pope. What do you say in 1 minute with the Pope? You say, COVID orphanhood, we need to do something about it. And they resulted in President Biden discussing these findings in the COVID 2022 Global Summit. And I think the 2 lessons, all universities should have childcare and use the networks that you have. So I have just 2 last lessons that I've learned. That is that we must believe in our continent. And I think 2 examples of this to me are to a student and a colleague. And neither of them are here today, actually. They're both from Sudan. Mona isn't here because she's helping her parents get out of Khartoum. And Bethana isn't here because she's giving a talk about Sudan right now. And Mona was in particular leading a whole set of work with the Sudanese government about programs that could improve policies for youth. That collapsed about a few weeks ago when the conflict started, and they turned around and took our parenting work, which we'd done in COVID, and rapidly turned it into parenting response and emergency violence prevention response for families in Sudan, which is being delivered right now. But I think what really matters is that those two are examples of people who believe in our continent even when it's going really wrong. And what we have to do is keep that belief. Research is slow, events are fast, and we have to look to that future and what we can do. And that, I think, is my last lesson, is that our job, and part of our job, is to look not only at the challenges that are faced now, but the challenges of Africa's future. And sometimes when I look at those, it makes me want to hide, or just go and watch episodes of Bridgerton to make myself feel better. But if we look to our future, and this I think has really come forward in this conference from Judy's talk, from the keynote at lunch, but there is going to be some pretty hectic stuff happening in the next 10 years. We're going to see increased climate hazards. WHO predicts new epidemics and new outbreaks. We're seeing increasing political polarization and more complex and overspilling warfare. For me, that means that we have to work out how our children are going to do okay despite all of this. What services do we need to put in? What anticipatory action do we need to do? But for you and in your research, we are going to need to think about this stuff. And we're going to need to start planning the research now. Don't do what I did with Manto. We need to start planning the research now that we will need in 7 years' time for our continent. And so I end with one last thing. And that is that the people in this room are the people who are going to make a difference for our continent. We and you have that capacity. And with the degrees that you are getting and have, and the power of the universities that we come from, we actually have the influence and capacity to do that. And if we don't, who else will? Thank you.